Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Inigold. Now, there have been protests almost every day in Myanmar since the military coup last month. The authorities' response, though initially peaceful, has become increasingly violent. And so far, more than 20 people have been killed. There have been more clashes today, with security forces using tear gas and stun grenades against protesters in Myanmar's biggest city, Yangon. There's been international condemnation of the escalating violence, but not much from the region until now. Foreign ministers from the 10-member Association of Southeast Asian Nations, known as Asean, have been meeting with Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, describing the use of lethal force against protesters as unacceptable. Well, for more on this, I'm joined now in the studio by Arise correspondent Faith Orr. Good to see you. Today's ASEAN meeting focusing on events in Myanmar. What emerged from that meeting?
So this was an emergency meeting of foreign ministers of the ASEAN nations, and they're calling for Myanmar's military rulers to stop the violence against the protesters and to immediately release Aung San Suu Kyi and the other leaders of her ruling party. Now, this meeting lasted about 2 hours, and they're saying, this is a sort of first step if these actions are taken to quell the unrest in Myanmar that we've seen since the coup, which happened on the 1st of February. Now, that saw Suu Kyi detained, along with those other leaders of the National League for Democracy, and she actually appeared in court yesterday. Another 2 charges were added to the 2 that she's already facing. She'll appear again in 2 weeks' time.
Farcical charges, I might add.
Well, yes, quite. But nonetheless, she is in prison and she is facing them. So from the meeting today, we have seen individual responses from the different foreign ministers of ASEAN. Malaysia's foreign minister says talks between the military and the ruling party are the way forward. Best chance at resolving things, they say, and to avoid an escalation which could actually lead to foreign intervention. Now, they're offering 3 proposals. This is from Malaysia for ASEAN and Myanmar to consider. So the first is the setting up of a group of what the foreign minister is describing as eminent persons to oversee electoral matters, which of course is at the heart of this dispute in Myanmar. He's also suggesting a visit to Myanmar by the ASEAN chairman and the Secretary General, or the engagement between ASEAN, Myanmar and other outside powers without specifying what those outside powers are. It's not just Malaysia that we heard from. We did hear from Singapore's Prime Minister just prior to those talks, stressing as well that talks between the ruling party and the military are the way forward. He's hesitant to commit to any sort of intervention, but he's also not ruling it out. What he has said is that we need to express disapproval for what is done, which is against the values of many other nations and indeed against the values of much of humanity. So those are quite strong words there from Singapore.
Absolutely, but that's quite extraordinary, isn't it? Because, I mean, we're not used to seeing that kind of united front from ASEAN, and in fact, in many cases, they're not united. They have different approaches. Even the statements you were talking about, they have different approaches within ASEAN. So the words of someone like the Singaporean Prime Minister are not necessarily representative of the group's position, is it? But
no, I mean, this is a 10-nation bloc. It's not known for working in unison at all. Singapore does have slightly more leverage on this particular subject, particularly over Myanmar. They invest quite a lot of money into the country. There's quite a lot of economic influence there. So perhaps that gives Singapore more leverage here than some of the other nations involved in this meeting today. But it's not just Singapore that have some strong words. We have heard from Indonesia as well, the foreign minister there, Retno Marsudi. Now, she wants Aung San Suu Kyi and other leaders released immediately. She says ASEAN's good intentions are meaningless if Myanmar just keeps the door closed to them. Now, she has said that ASEAN's principle of non-interference is a must, and that must be upheld, and that no single nation has any intentions of breaking this or violating this principle of non-interference. But at the same time, She says that upholding and implementing values of democracy, respect of human rights, good governance, rule of law, and constitutional government are equally important. So we have heard some strong words coming from these foreign ministers, less so from the Philippines, who refused to comment, other than to say that the meeting was outstanding, in his words.
Well, the things that you mentioned there are quite significant. But the other problem for them is that dealing with the military in Myanmar in any capacity is not approved by the protesters in Myanmar because they regard the military government as illegitimate. So that's a tricky bit, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, from the part of the protesters, they simply want the civilian, democratically elected government back in charge. They want the military out of power. They are calling on the international community to help that happen. Some want military intervention. Most of the demonstrators are asking ASEAN to put in place what they describe as punitive measures, whether that be economic sanctions, that sort of thing, to pressure the military into restoring this democratic rule. Now, ASEAN tends to favour order over justice. This isn't a group, this isn't the UN Security Council. They're known for keeping order rather than these sort of, these interventions that can put coups down. There is also, there's unlikely to be this military intervention, and there is also some self-interest at play here. For instance, Laos and Vietnam are both single-party states. Brunei is absolute monarchy. Cambodia is governed by a strongman, Hun Sen. Thailand's prime minister is backed by the military. I have no doubt that these countries are thinking if they open the door to this right now, it's going to lead to their own downfall eventually. Might be the United States, actually, that is the protesters' best bet here. They have been making some noise in the United Nations, in the Security Council. So if anyone is going to intervene in behalf of these protesters, it could be the US and not ASEAN.
That's a very interesting point. So what is happening today in Myanmar? We've heard reports of more clashes.
Yes, not just in Yangon, across the country. Ahead of these talks, during these talks, protesters kept coming out. Police have hit back, live fire, water cannon, tear gas, just what we normally see when they're hitting back at these crowds of protesters. And this is to try and disperse them. As I said, towns and cities across the country. It is a widespread protest. There have been several injuries today. We haven't heard of any further deaths today, but of course in recent days we have seen mass arrests, protesters dying as forces fired into the crowd. We did see at least 18 people dead on Sunday. That was the bloodiest day of the coup so far. As I said, no deaths reported today, but that could change.
And what about the Rohingya Muslim minority in Myanmar? I mean, they've been rather quiet recently to all this, but I understand that some of them are now voicing fears for their future because obviously the army that has oppressed them is now back in control.
I mean, the Rohingya had really high hopes when Aung San Suu Kyi took power in 2015. Those hopes were resolutely dashed in 2017 when we saw one of the worst atrocities to have ever hit those people. 1 million people ended up fleeing into Bangladesh as there was murder, there was rape, homes burned down, villages burned to the ground. So they by no means hold her in much high esteem. They were denied the right to vote, they were left off the national census. Despite all of this, her downfall is being met with fear by the Rohingya population. And that's because the general who led the ethnic cleansing in 2017 has now taken charge of the whole country.
Oh dear.
So she might have been powerless, Aung San Suu Kyi. She wasn't in charge of the military, she was powerless to stop it then. And although she didn't stand up against it, now we don't even have the veneer of a civilian government that the military have to answer to. The Rohingya are afraid that the military are in charge now, and they have every right to be afraid.
So we've got about 30 seconds. So the upshot is that the military seem determined to hold on to power and the protesters seem determined to continue to protest. So the clashes are likely to continue.
They are indeed. The demonstrators seem to be resisting calls for them to leave the streets more and more. They're resisting arrest, they're resisting the military, and they seem more determined than ever to do that.
Faith, thank you very much indeed. Faith, or Arise correspondent there. That's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again tomorrow from me and the entire team here in Abuja. Bye-bye, and thank you for watching.